we're set. Thank you. Here we are. We're in our keynote with Yesenia Regalado, and I will let her and Juan take it from there, everybody.
All right, everyone, good morning. Let me just pull up my slideshow. I lost it, so let me just pull it back up again. And like I said, I did enable the chat, or ask the chat to be enabled, because I'm gonna have some portions of my presentation that are interactive. Okay. All right, so just want to confirm, Juan, can you see my main slide? All right, thank you. For as long as I've used Zoom, I actually haven't used the webinar feature. So thank you everyone for your patience. Okay. So good morning. My name is Yesenia Regalado, and I have almost 10 years of experience in the racial equity field as a facilitator and trainer. I'm privileged to be here with you all this morning because this is a topic that means a lot to me personally and professionally. Okay, do we need to wait for the captioning, Juan?
Yeah, give me 1 second. Captioning should be enabled. I'm just wanting to make sure before we get into the presentation.
Yeah.
Lisa, is there anything we can do on our end for captioning? I think we have the captioner. I just want to make sure.
We can start. I enabled automatic captions until our captioner is able to getting. So go ahead.
All right. Wonderful.
Okay. So currently I work at Impact Silver Spring in Maryland as a racial equity network builder. I create educational and awareness building spaces that promote more liberatory ways of how we can interact with each other in the pursuit of a more racially and economically just community. I do have my contact information here on the slide because I'm always looking to connect with community members, specifically in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, but also I know this is a national platform, so please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, or even just to set up a time for us to chat afterwards. I am also a member of the Silver Spring Justice Coalition. I serve on the Mental Health Committee, and the mission is to reduce the presence of police in our communities, eliminate violence and harm by the police, and establish transparency and accountability. It's through the Silver Spring Justice Coalition that I met Carlene and got introduced to the ARC. On a personal level, I am a daughter, sister, wife, and a mom. And I also have a diagnosed mental health challenge. Becoming a mom has really pushed me into the advocacy space, and I'm here to tell my story in the spirit of advocacy for healing and human-centered mental health care. So within my family, I've been very intentional about having transparent conversations on mental health because it has impacted all of us. Here are just some of the issues that we've navigated in my immediate family. I want to emphasize that I am not a mental health professional, nor am I a legal or policy expert in the mental health field. I'm only an expert in my lived experience around these issues. I hope that my perspective can help shed light on a sensitive topic that is not often discussed within communities of color. Everyone in my family has navigated the system in different ways, and although the focus of today's forum is crisis response, I want to zoom out and discuss my experience within the continuum of mental health services. And this is just one graphic that depicts how we can view this continuum. I will be focusing on the carceral nature of institutional care, as well as racial inequities that I have seen in the mental health care system. And somebody asked me if I could increase my screen. I'm not sure I can change the way that it's presented right now. What images, words, and emotions come up for you when I say carceral state? So if you could please put your responses in the chat so I can get an understanding of just where everyone, where everyone is and kind of like what's your familiarity with the topic. Okay. Punitive, prison industrial complex isolation. I saw isolation a couple times. Prison. Lack of freedom, being confined. Without access. Restraints, fear. Institutions, some people don't know this. Okay. I also, in the spirit of accessibility as well, I saw a couple comments that my slides aren't showing up on the full screen. So I do want to take a second to just pause and fix the issue. I think it's because I have my speaker notes on, but I think it's not letting the full screen come up. So let me okay, sorry, I really apologize everyone, but like I said, I do want to make sure that this is in an accessible format for people.
Yeah, it's full screen now.
Okay.
Mhm.
I will admit I cannot see my notes in this way, but I think it's okay. All right, so here's the definition from the University of Michigan's Carceral State Project. They define the carceral state as a punitive cluster of formal institutions and informal processes that place vulnerable and marginalized populations under surveillance, criminalization, control, and confinement in prisons, jails, immigrant and juvenile detention centers, as well as other institutions. And so I think this is one way in which we can look at the carceral state again, right, through this very formal institutions. Specifically, I think the imagery that comes up a lot is prison and jails. But what I want to do is actually expand what we mean when we say carceral. And I really like Professor Rubia Tabia from the University of Michigan. Gives an alternative definition that doesn't just focus on incarceration, but she calls the carceral state the logics, ideologies, practices, and structures that result in punitive orientations to difference. And I really want to highlight this aspect right here, the punitive orientations to difference. And I think that that's really something that we need to consider when thinking about mental health challenges, is that it is a difference, but the way that we respond to that does not have to be punitive. And disability justice organizer Stephanie Lynn Kaufman also gives some perspectives on how mental health institutions are carceral. She says they contain people, take away their locus of control, offer surveillance, isolate them from their communities, and limit their freedoms. And I think this is really important to emphasize in terms of a perspective, because again, when we just focus on the carcerality of crisis response, we're not really seeing the bigger picture to what happens afterwards. And so I do want to say that I myself have been institutionalized 5 times in my life. Some were voluntary, some were involuntary. I've had the range of experiences. I've had really dehumanizing, disempowering experiences, as well as healing and transformative experiences. And that's what I'm really here to kind of show, is the range of that, and just perspectives to consider. So I mentioned that I twice in my life I've been under involuntary commitment. So in the chat, can you also put any images, words, and emotions that come up for you when I say involuntary commitment? Kidnapping, loss of autonomy, powerless, panic, doom, I'm sorry, force. Okay, feeling defeated. Loss of freedom. Confusion against your will. Okay. Lack of self-control, loss of freedom. Great, thank you for all of that. And so this is how involuntary treatment is defined in many states. They define it as being a danger to yourself, others, or having grave disability. There tends to be steps to this process. You have an emergency psychiatric evaluation. Then if you do not consent to treatment, they can keep you through a court-ordered hospitalization. And then in some states, there's also outpatient civil commitment, which is a court-ordered outpatient treatment. And I just want to emphasize, because I do live in Maryland, that Maryland is one of only 5 states that does not define dangerousness or grave disability. And this is problematic because it leaves this open for subjectivity and can perpetuate racial biases in the carceral state. So it's only until since last year in 2021 that the Behavioral Health Administration changed, they got a commission to look into this. And so the reason why I'm elevating that again is because especially for people of color, when we have words such as, dangerous, I think it could really perpetuate some of the stigma. And again, it can be also left up to interpretation. But the big point that I want to make here is that I think there's a big, there can be a big discussion on this topic. It remains controversial because of the significant limitations of liberty. But one thing I want to say is that even when you are admitted involuntary, that the focus should be on returning to health and not framed as reducing danger. When you set up a dichotomy of something as safe and something as dangerous, this is one way that you're participating in the carceral state. It really changes how a person views themselves, how they view asking for help. And this is really my experience and my story. At the age of 19, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And within a period of 6 months, I received psychiatric inpatient hospital services, and again, 2 of which were involuntary. And it was in Richmond, Virginia, where I really experienced the carceral state. Although a healthcare provider and my parents thought that they were sending me somewhere where I could get help, it was very traumatic and contributed to a lot of my internalized stigma and a negative way of how I viewed myself. It also shaped the interactions I had in the subsequent 12 years. And so what I'd like to do now is just share my experience the first time, right, entering an institution at 19 years old in a state of crisis, kind of what I experienced and the messages that I internalized from this. And one thing that I also want to be very clear about is I'm not here to critique or debate why these things are the way that they are. Again, I'm not an expert in risk management. I'm not a mental health professional. My goal is just to give you this perspective of the impact and trauma that it had on me. There were restrictive security measures to enter the unit and no ability to leave. And so with that, the messages that I internalized were you are being locked up for something bad and you are deviant. They removed all my personal belongings, gave me a uniform and undergarments to wear that were mandatory. The messages that I internalized from this is that people with mental illness are inherently dangerous, and I am no longer an individual. I had no bodily autonomy and was told when I could eat, when I could shower, when I could sleep, when I could communicate with people, and what meds to take without consent. The message I received and internalized was we can control you. All of my communication over the phone and in person was timed and surveilled. The message, you are untrustworthy. If I refused to comply with the rules, I was reprimanded with privileges being taken away from me or punished with additional time added to my stay. The message, everything is transactional. They told me the doctor was the only person who could release me. The message, someone holds the power and I'm the subordinate. And finally, once I was stable, there were contingencies to my release and I had to comply with seeing an outpatient psychiatrist and taking meds. The message, treatment is only acceptable if it looks a certain way. And so I just want you to quickly put into the chat, what images of institutions come up when you see these type of messages? Prison and humane, jail, prison, a broken system. Thank you. And so again, the carceral state is not just limited to a formal institution, but it's really a logic, right? In a state of doing things where this is the impact. Yes, dehumanizing, inhumane, dictatorship, all of these things. And again, I want to emphasize, I've had the spectrum of experiences, so we'll talk about other experiences, but this was my first introduction into the mental health care system. And again, I was in crisis. And so you can imagine, how much this impacted me as I continued to begin the journey of getting treatment. I want to point out racial inequities that I saw within my experience. I will say that although it was very oppressive, I do have certain privileges. So I'm gonna elevate maybe areas that I have privileges, but that I know that people in my community, specifically in the Latino community, do not. The first is language. I myself, English is my first language. I did not have any barriers in that sense. But for Spanish speaking, monolingual speaking people, if you don't have your providers who speak your language, it's very dehumanizing, it's very confusing, it adds to the stigma. And it is a huge barrier to access. I had access to health insurance, not only through my parents, but at the time as a university student, I had free access to care as well. And so we also know that this is a big area of inaccessibility for people. And one thing that I don't know if people realize is even if you have health insurance, it doesn't cover everything, especially if you're within, in my experience, like a hospital setting, right? And so then that comes down to like family support. I myself did have my family support. I had a home to go back to, right? They were able to pay for the additional expenses, but I do want to lift up that for some people, their mental health challenges get in the way of steady employment and housing. In terms of the economic security, I just also want to elevate that unfortunately, these things are very stigmatized and people do lose their employment. They lose their jobs, their income. In some cases, people lose custody of their kids. And so I think these are also barriers in what's contributing to the stigma and wanting to get help. I also want to lift up when we're talking about racial inequities, that people of color do face racism, discrimination, violence, poverty, and all these things take a toll on your mental health, right? So it's not just the access to these things, but it's just the everyday experience of being a person of color. There's also misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis, and the prison industrial complex that's set up to keep people of color confined. And there is a history of abuse in receiving healthcare treatment. So as you can imagine, my transition back to normal was anything but. I struggled with my diagnosis at the beginning. I did not take meds. I was very resentful towards my parents. I was very mistrusting of healthcare providers. I often lied about my struggles and my progress because of a crippling fear that I had of going back to the institution. Unfortunately, I got hospitalized again after a suicide attempt. And then nothing changed in my experience. And if, while I was there, and if anything, it was even more intrusive. I was still in a power struggle with my providers. I couldn't find a psychiatrist who I wanted to work with, and I felt like a failure because I took a withdrawal from school. My symptoms were not improving, and one night around 2 a.m., I needed help. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to cause more conflict within my family and didn't want things to escalate. So I did call the police because, 20-year-old me didn't know, right, who else to call. In retrospect, I really could have benefited greatly from having 988. In this interaction, the police did show up unarmed, and they did have a support person with them who I believe was a mental health professional. I needed help, but it wasn't necessarily a crisis. And the issue got resolved by them really taking the time to talk to me, to listen, to troubleshoot some things. They even gave me a ride to one of my best friend's house where I felt more safe. I do want to emphasize that my experience when I had the crisis intervention team come out is not the experience of a lot of people of color. You're going to hear the range of those perspectives and experiences throughout this conference. I want to lift up that there have been countless people of color who have been killed by the police, one in crisis and one seeking support. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention locally in Montgomery County the deaths of Robert White, Finan Brahe, Kevin Coslow, and Ryan LaRox. I also want to lift up that there are other ways to handle crisis response that do not include the police. These are just two examples, Cahoots and Mental Health First, that can be used as alternatives. But again, I want to focus on, right, shifting the mentality to not just getting police response out of crisis response, but really, right, how can we start to end the carceral state within institutions? So I do want to jump to my present day experience. After my third hospitalization and many months of severe symptoms, I decided I did not want to live my life in and out of institutions. And so I really doubled down with my family on outpatient care. During this time, it took a lot of trial and error with meds, with side effects that made things worse and made me more sick. Several attempts to find a psychiatrist that I felt was aligned with my goals. Years and years to even find a therapist who I trusted. But I am very proud to say that for over 10 years, I have been in recovery. And I do have a co-designed treatment plan with healthcare providers and my families. And I have not had the need for any hospital intervention. However, even with all these places, all this support in place, I did not get the proper support that I needed during my labor and delivery experience. And this was a year ago. I decided to check in voluntary to inpatient psychiatric services 24 hours after I gave birth. And that process revealed a few things. The first is, I grew up in Virginia, but now I lived in Maryland, and my family didn't know who to call. They did not know where to send me and kind of like what to do without calling the cops. And again, I was in a state of I needed help, but I wasn't quite in crisis, and I did not want the police to be called. So they had to just Google, call around. That process took quite a while. Once I actually, once they actually found an ER that was able to take me, it took almost 18 hours for a bed to open up. Although I did go voluntarily, um, I was not able to leave just whenever I wanted. I had to apply for an against medical advice, and this was information that was not easily accessible, and it took a lot of self advocacy. And although there were the similar elements of security and surveillance, this experience was drastically different than what I had in Richmond, Virginia. One of the primary reasons for this is because I was admitted into what's considered the high functioning adult unit. And so here's what that meant. It meant that I was able to play an active role in decisions. I was able to consent to treatment. Peer support was used as an approach to wellness that broke down the power dynamics between the providers and the clients. And the goal was to keep as much autonomy as possible. And I think that these things should be a part of everyone's care, regardless if you are high functioning, regardless if you're in crisis, or what mental health challenges you are dealing with. I think it perpetuates the carceral state when certain forms of mental illness are seen as, maybe good behavior and maybe not as much in distress. And I do think that there is a system of rewards and punishment. And so I do want to get into the same institution 6 months later.
And Yesenia, we're running just a little bit behind. I know we started a little late, but this is great information. But I wanted to let people know we're running a little bit behind.
Okay.
And would you be available to continue chatting with people in the lobby?
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to say quickly that in this particular instance, they called the police into the unit. And I was not getting my needs met with dignity. And I did get forcefully sedated. And the messages, again, that I received from this was there's no accountability for when you advocate for quality care. We can shut you up with power and dominance, and you have no bodily autonomy. And so again, right, this is the same institution within a period of 6 months where the first time around I had a really healing and transformative experience. And the second time around, right, there were cops involved as an intimidation tactic. And again, like no accountability. And I guess I will end there with this. I'm not sure if we want to just close out with some closing thoughts or if there are questions.
I think Juan had a question for you, and then we'll move you over to the lobby and people can continue chatting with you there. I think thank you so much. I agree with everybody in the chat that it was really great of you to share your personal experience, and also, to include some things about what went well in one experience that should be duplicated for others. Juan, did you have a question for Yesenia? Not sure. So everybody can see that we're running just a little bit behind. And I do want to be respectful of our other panelists who are waiting in the family session. So we're going to go ahead and end this session. and people can continue with Yesenia in the lobby with some Q&A there. And thank you everybody for attending this session. Come on over. We're going to start our session on families in, I'd say, just about 3 minutes. So we'll see you in there. There are questions in the, oh no, there aren't questions in the chat, but yes, go ahead and put questions in the lobby for her and she'll join you there.
Yes, I will hang out in the lobby.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.